He thought my silence was weakness. He thought that if he mocked me, betrayed me, and pushed me aside, I'd simply stay quiet. But silence isn't the same as surrender. Sometimes silence is a storm gathering strength. And when the day came to stand in the courtroom, my voice, steady, clear, undeniable, proved him wrong in every way. Tell me, have you ever been underestimated, only to show your strength when it mattered most? Drop it in the comments. Now let's step into today's story. For years, I played the quiet wife. When he dismissed my ideas, I let it slide. When he belittled me in front of friends, I smiled through the sting. When he hid finances, made decisions without me, treated me like a shadow in my own home, I stayed silent. Not because I was weak, not because I didn't notice, but because I believed marriage meant patience, compromise, and trust. I cooked the meals, paid the bills, raised the children, kept the house standing while he strutted about, convinced he was the backbone of our lives. But behind closed doors, I began to see the cracks. Bank statements hidden at the back of drawers, receipts that didn't match the stories he told, whispers of late nights at work that didn't add up. One evening, I found the proof, a bill from a hotel tucked carelessly into his coat pocket. My hands trembled as I held it, the numbers on the page telling me what his lips never would. He wasn't just betraying me as a husband, he was mocking me, assuming I was too blind, too quiet, too old to notice. I didn't confront him right away. Instead, I stayed silent. I tucked that slip of paper into a folder. And then I began to gather more. Bank transfers, messages, copies of documents he thought I'd never see. Each piece was small on its own, but together they painted a story that couldn't be denied. When he caught me looking once, he laughed. "You won't do anything," he sneered. "You've never had the guts." He was right about one thing. I didn't fight him in the kitchen or the living room. I didn't throw accusations across the dinner table. My battle wasn't there. My battle was waiting in a place he never thought I'd step foot, the courtroom. And as the day drew near, I held my silence like a weapon, because he thought quiet meant powerless. But I knew quiet could mean preparation. And when the gavel finally struck, and the judge called our case, I was ready. The day of the hearing arrived with a sharp chill in the air. I dressed carefully that morning, not in anything flashy or meant to impress, but in clothes that made me feel steady, strong. I pinned back my hair, clasped a necklace my mother had given me years ago, and looked at myself in the mirror. "You're not invisible," I whispered to my reflection. At the courthouse, he was already there. My husband, soon-to-be ex, stood in the hallway with his lawyer, laughing, shoulders squared, exuding confidence like a man who thought the outcome was already written. When he spotted me, his smirk widened. "So you showed up," he said, his tone mocking. "I thought you'd be too scared." I said nothing. I simply walked past him into the courtroom. Inside, the room felt heavy, the polished wood gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The judge sat high above, calm and detached. I took my place at the plaintiff's table, smoothing the papers in front of me. My folder, neat, organized, filled with months of careful gathering, sat like a shield at my side. He, on the other hand, leaned back in his chair at the defendant's table, grinning as if the whole thing were a performance for his amusement. I could almost hear his thoughts. She won't speak. She won't fight. She'll crumble the moment she's questioned. But he didn't know the storm that silence had been holding back. When the proceedings began, his lawyer spoke first, confident, rehearsed, painting him as the victim of a misunderstanding, a good provider, a respectable man, someone wronged by suspicion and overreaction. And when it was his turn to speak, he played his part well. With crocodile tears and carefully chosen words, he painted me as bitter, emotional, out of touch. He shook his head and said, "She's imagining things. She always does. She's never been strong enough to understand how the world works." The words stung, but I let them pass over me, because I knew what was coming. When the judge turned to me, asking if I had anything to present, I rose slowly. My knees trembled, but my voice did not. "Yes, Your Honor," I said, sliding the folder across the table. One by one, I laid it out. Bank statements showing secret accounts, receipts from dinners and hotels, screenshots of messages he thought had disappeared, copies of transactions that proved he had siphoned money from our joint savings. Gasps rippled through the room. His lawyer leaned forward, eyes widening as each page stacked against them. And for the first time all day, my husband's smirk faltered. I met his eyes then, steady and unshaken. "I may have been quiet," I said, my voice firm, "but I was not blind, and I was not powerless." The judge nodded slowly, flipping through the evidence. "It appears," he said evenly, that the silence spoke louder than words, and in that moment I felt it. The shift. The weight of years of mockery, dismissal, and betrayal tipping back, landing squarely where it belonged. The silence in the courtroom after I laid down the evidence was deafening. For years he had thrived on laughter, on making me the butt of his jokes, on hearing people snicker at my expense. But in that room there was no laughter, only the sound of papers being turned, each page damning him further. His lawyer scrambled to recover. "Your Honor, this is circumstantial. These receipts, these statements, they don't prove intent." But the judge's eyes were sharp. "It proves a pattern, a clear one." I sat taller in my chair, my voice steady now. "Your Honor, for years I stayed silent. I endured his dismissals, his betrayals. I thought patience was strength, but silence isn't consent. And it isn't ignorance. It's watching, waiting, collecting truth until it cannot be denied." A murmur rippled through the gallery. I glanced at my husband, his face red, his hands gripping the edge of the table. That smug smirk he wore like armor was gone, replaced by something I had rarely seen in him. Fear. He slammed his palm against the table suddenly, his voice cracking. "She's twisting everything. She's making me out to be some kind of monster." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Sir, control yourself." I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. I simply opened the next folder tab and slid forward another document. "This," I said evenly, "is a transfer of funds from our joint account to a private one under his name, on the same day he told me we couldn't afford our son's tuition payment." Gasps echoed again. His lawyer buried his face in his hands. For once, the power wasn't his. It was mine. The judge leaned back, folding his hands. "Mrs. Carter, your presentation is thorough. Is there anything else you'd like to add?" I took a deep breath, my voice clear. "Yes, Your Honor. For years, I believed staying quiet kept the peace. But in reality, it only kept me small. Today, I speak not out of anger, but out of truth, and truth deserves a voice." The room stilled. Even the clerk paused mid-note, eyes fixed on me. My husband, on the other hand, had begun to unravel. He tugged at his tie, his face glistening with sweat. His whispers to his lawyer turned frantic, desperate. He kept glancing at the judge, at me, at the pile of evidence that grew taller with each passing moment, and I realized something in that instant. He wasn't just fighting to win a case. He was fighting to hold on to the illusion that he had control, that I was still the quiet, powerless wife who would never dare speak against him. But that illusion was gone. The silence he once mocked had transformed into the very thing that destroyed his facade. And as the judge called for a short recess, I leaned back in my chair, steady and calm. For the first time in years, I wasn't the one shrinking in the shadows. I was the one standing in the light. When the judge returned from recess, the air in the courtroom was thick with tension. My husband's swagger was gone. He sat hunched over, whispering furiously with his lawyer, his hands trembling as he shuffled papers that could no longer protect him. The judge cleared his throat, his gaze sweeping across the room. "We've reviewed substantial evidence today," he said, "and I will be frank, this evidence is troubling." My husband's lawyer leapt to his feet, voice high and rushed. "Your Honor, we contend that these documents are being misinterpreted. My client—" "Enough." The judge cut him off. His tone was sharp, final. "The documents speak for themselves." The words landed like a gavel before the gavel even fell. My husband's face drained of color. He glanced at me across the room, searching for some hint of the timid wife he once knew, the one who would avert her eyes, smooth over the tension, take the blame to keep the peace. But I didn't look away. I met his gaze, steady, unflinching. The judge turned to me. "Mrs. Carter, you've conducted yourself with clarity and composure today. Do you have any closing words?" I rose slowly, my palms resting on the table to steady myself. My voice, though quiet, filled the room. "Yes, Your Honor. For years I thought silence was the safest choice. That if I stayed quiet, if I endured, I could hold my family together. But silence became his weapon. He mistook it for weakness. He mocked me, dismissed me, and thought he could live 2 lives without consequence." I paused, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. "Today isn't about revenge," I continued. "It's about truth. And the truth is simple. A marriage without respect isn't a marriage. And a voice once silenced can and will speak when the time comes." When I sat down, the room was so still you could hear the clock ticking on the far wall. The judge nodded, his expression unreadable, then turned his gaze to my husband. "Do you have anything to add before I give my ruling?" For the first time that day, my husband's voice cracked. She's exaggerating. She's twisting," but the judge raised a hand, silencing him. "What I see here is not exaggeration. What I see is a clear betrayal of trust, financial misconduct, and an attempt to manipulate and belittle your spouse. That ends today." The gavel struck, firm and final. My husband slumped in his chair, the fight drained out of him. His lawyer patted his shoulder weakly, already knowing the battle was lost. And me? I sat straighter. My hands, which had once trembled, now felt steady. Because in that moment, the silence that had defined my years in his shadow was gone. My voice, calm, clear, undeniable, had spoken, and it had been heard. When I stepped out of that courtroom, the winter air hit my face like a cleansing wind. I paused at the top of the courthouse steps, drawing in a long breath, the sky above crisp and endless. For the first time in years, I felt light. Behind me, I could hear him arguing with his lawyer, his voice sharp, panicked, desperate. Once upon a time, those words would have sent me shrinking into myself, trying to soothe the storm before it spilled over. But now they sounded distant, almost hollow, like echoes from a life I no longer lived. Because the truth was simple. The courtroom had changed everything. I thought back to the years of silence, the nights I stayed awake alone, swallowing words I wanted to speak. The mornings I pasted on a smile after being mocked, belittled, brushed aside. The countless moments when I chose quiet because I thought it was safer, because I thought speaking would only bring more pain. And maybe it did keep the peace for a while. But it also kept me small. That day in court, I realized silence doesn't protect you. It cages you. And when the door finally opens, the voice that steps out is sharper, stronger, and steadier than ever before. I hadn't screamed. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't hurled insults or matched his mockery. Instead, I let the truth speak, page by page, document by document. And the truth was louder than any joke he had ever made at my expense. I didn't walk away with joy exactly. Divorce is never joyful, betrayal never easy, but I walked away with dignity. And dignity, once reclaimed, is worth more than any marriage lived in silence. As I reached the bottom of the courthouse steps, a stranger, an older woman who had sat quietly in the gallery, touched my arm. Her eyes were wet as she whispered, "You were brave today." I smiled at her, my heart swelling, because bravery doesn't always look like fire. Sometimes it looks like patience. Sometimes it looks like gathering every scrap of proof while the world thinks you're weak. And sometimes it looks like standing in a courtroom, steady and unshaken, while the person who mocked you crumbles under the weight of his own lies. That day I proved him wrong, but more importantly, I proved myself right. I was never weak. I was never powerless. I was never just the quiet wife. I was a woman with a voice, and once I chose to use it, nothing could silence me again. So here's what I've learned. Silence isn't always weakness, but when it becomes a cage, it steals your strength. My husband thought I would stay quiet forever, that his mockery, his lies, and his betrayals would go unanswered. But the courtroom showed otherwise. You don't need to scream to be heard. Sometimes the calmest voice, backed by truth, carries the most power. And when that truth finally speaks, it can shake walls, break chains, and end years of injustice in a single moment. He underestimated me. He thought silence meant surrender. But that day, silence turned into strength, and strength turned into freedom. Tell me, have you ever been underestimated, only to prove everyone wrong? Share your story in the comments, and stay with us. More stories of quiet justice are yet to come.